Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. My name is David. I've got Zach here, and we are blessed with Paul here to talk about Canada. But first, I'd like him to introduce himself to those who don't know who he is.
Well, no, probably people don't know who I am. Paul Fairfield. I'm a philosophy professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Been here since 2002 is when I started here. Born and raised in Ontario, southeast Ontario, from a little town called Brockville is my hometown, not too far from where I live now, which is Kingston. Written a number of books over the years. I probably won't go into all of those.
Well, I'm sure we'll get into some of them for sure.
But yeah, I'm a philosophy professor here at Queen's, and live here with my wife and 10-year-old daughter, and that's my story.
I like it. So, Paul, what do you love about Canada?
You know, I've been thinking about this. I've been listening to your podcasts and listening to other people's answers. A lot of the familiar things that people say, I would echo that as well. The diversity, the cultural diversity, I think is a very interesting quality. The history of this country, I've come to appreciate. I read a lot of history these days. New France, history of New France, I'm especially interested in. And just it's hard to put your finger on Canada, just what it is and what is it that we love about this country. It's a place that is kind of unique in the world in a lot of ways, but there's an elusive, I think, quality to it.
It's almost mysterious. It seems. Hey, how
it is.
We seem like an impossible thing that just keeps trucking along.
I think so. I mean, I've been wondering, well, why is it so? What is that mystery? Well, why is it so elusive? Why do Canadians have such a hard time, including me, understanding what it is we love about our country, or even what this country is? There's something elusive there, and I think that the elusiveness to Canadian self-understanding just as a feature of our national youth. We're still, in relative to other nations anyway, a relatively youthful nation. And self-understanding is not a quality of youth. It comes with age and experience. And, you know, if when you were 20 years old, you probably didn't know who you are very well.
Right.
You get 40, 50, you start to understand yourself and have some confidence. And I think that the same can be said of nations. You know, the US is older than we are. They have a larger population. There's more of a confidence and a self-understanding there. And I think you see that in older societies in Europe. You know, ask the Greeks, ask the Romans, who are you? Then they can talk about 2,000 or 3,000 years of history. That's who they are, because our history makes us who we are. We have less history.
Right. That's a good point that has never been raised on this podcast before. Do you want to dive into that on a corporate and then maybe even individual level? Because we like to move micro macro and just kind of go the zooming in and zooming out, because I find it makes people remember things better when we make it both personal but also like basically when we anthropomorphize our nation.
Yeah, well, I'm myself, I'm typical Canadian, and in a lot of ways spent my whole life here in Ontario specifically. I'm 11th generation Canadian on my father's side. My paternal ancestors came over from France in 1666. An ancestor named Jean Beauchamp.
Wow. 11 generations. That's, I think, even better than Zach and I.
I've been on my ancestry website,
following the genealogy back, eh?
On the genealogy, it's a long, fascinating. I just find it a very fascinating story to learn the story of just my family history, who they were, why they came here, what they believed, and just what life was like for them. Trying to understand, trying to imagine what they were, you know, who they were, and what they went through. And then trace the steps down through the generations, down to my own time. So trying to understand, you know, we're all trying to understand who we are
Mm-hmm.
individually, as a collective, as a group, whatever group we belong to, and as a nation as well. And I think self-understanding comes with that historical consciousness. So I think, I feel like I have a better personal self-understanding, knowing something more about my family history and telling my own, my parents, my brothers and sisters about our family history.
What is it about? What would you say? I like this. I especially like the idea of. I mean, this is basically man's search for meaning, right? We're trying to discover. Well, that it seems to be the thing that drives humans to excel is this desire to understand. Even when you watch, I was watching a recent interview with Elon Musk, and he said at about 11 or 12, I had this existential crisis about what the meaning was, and I've realized we don't have the tools to understand meaning quite yet. But maybe if we expand civilization and keep consciousness alive, we can figure it out. And it's funny when people look at him and he's so science based and all about engineering and like basically the nuts and bolts of science, and yet even he needed this idea of self to wrapper his genius around, or he could have just faded into nothingness.
I think we all need that, but I think if we're speaking the language of science, we're not going to get much of an answer. I think we need to go to culture and to history.
Yes, I 100% agree. In fact, I think it's the overemphasis on what I call the religion of science as opposed to the philosophy of science that has got us in part of the predicament we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, science, we all love science, but it's not where you're going to find understanding, the meaning of life, the meaning of anything. Meaning is more of a philosophical, existential, moral notion than a scientific one. So I don't think you're going to find meaning or understand or self-understanding in the world of science. You're going to find it in history and culture and art, in philosophy. So as a professor of philosophy, I deal with these questions quite often, and I'm in a philosophical tradition where great thinkers have been trying to deal with these questions for a couple of thousand years now. And when you try and think about a series of questions for a couple of thousand years, you do make some progress.
Yes, agreed. Could you share with us some of the progress that you've seen made in that field, and maybe how that applies to this quest that Zach and I are on in our own way, but maybe all of Canada is, to become introspective and discover what we are?
Well, I mean, there's a large question as to whether there is progress in philosophy and in the history of ideas, and I'm not sure that I would say that there is exactly progress, but there is. I think of philosophy as something like a conversation that goes on and on and on, and sometimes it takes turns that are unexpected and contingent, and something new, some new question, some new point of view comes out, and we get somewhere, but we don't go in a straight line in any kind of teleological or progressive way. But I think if you go back to the beginning of philosophy, the ancient Greeks, from the very beginning, were asking questions like, what is the relation between the one and the many? How is there unity in diversity? And this is, a question that we in Canada have been asking explicitly for a very long time. What is Canada? What is the unity amid all this plurality, all this diversity? So questions like this have been with us for many, many centuries. And by the time I think we get into the 20th century, we have a philosophical tradition like the one I'm in, philosophical hermeneutics, which deals explicitly with the nature of understanding and what makes it possible to understand anything, ourselves, art, history, anything at all.
For the listeners, can you dive into that a little bit more? Like, I'm a huge fan of this particular topic. Like, how do we know things? What do you mean when you say this philosophic tradition? Because there's going to be some listeners probably who don't understand what that means.
Yeah, philosophical hermeneutics is the tradition that I work in. It's a tradition of thought that goes back a couple of centuries, specifically in German, originally in German philosophy, and then French, and then around the world. It's a tradition associated with some of the bigger names are Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, Wilhelm Dilthey, more at the turn of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger in the early mid-20th century, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur, writers in this tradition.
I guess I want to know, do you think it is possible to understand anything at all?
Yes, in a highly imperfect way.
Right. No, absolutely. Obviously, all stimuli is filtered through subjectivity. But okay, let's get down to the nitty gritty of this then. Like, how would you make the argument that it is possible to understand things for the listeners?
Well, I think you can appeal to your own experience. We all understand things. If I say things, we probably understand a little bit more than we think we do. If I ask you about, I don't know, music, some recording artist that you know, you listen to their music, you say, okay, I mention Rush. There's a good Canadian example. I say, okay, do you know them? And you say, yeah, I understand. Okay, what do you understand? Okay, your answer is not no. I mean, if you've heard the music, if you sat down, listened to the albums, and maybe seen them in concert and so on, then there's a certain level of understanding there. Now, what has made that possible? Well, your experience has made that possible. You've done the ordinary things. You've sat down, you've put on the record, you've listened to it over a period of time, a number of records over a series of years. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about Rush.
Right.
Whereas somebody else doesn't. So you know there from that example, I can mention 1,000 other examples, how you understand Rush. That is, what it means to you is not quite the same as what it means to me.
Right. In fact, it couldn't possibly be exactly the same, right?
Yeah, because you and I, we're not the same people. We don't have the same experience. We don't have the same history. I can remember, I mean, if you ask me about that band and who they are or what they mean, I'm going to tell you what they mean to me.
Right.
There's something very personal about it. I'm going to tell you the story of when I first heard them back in 1970 something, and when I first saw them in concert, and the big long story that stretches over decades, and then what it means to me. There's something unique about that. There's something very subjective about that, but it's also intersubjective, because you know what I mean when I say, oh, when this album came out, or when this song plays on the radio, or when I saw them at this concert in whatever year, it meant this to me.
Yeah.
Or, it means something similar to you too, but there's something very unique about that experience, because it has to kind of filter through your own personal experience, your own subjectivity. So there's something there that's socially shared, but something that's uniquely your own as well.
I'm sure you've heard this question. Maybe just tell me if it's a little bit too simple. But there's that whole conception of, how do I know that what I see as orange is what you see as orange, and yet we're both in agreement that it's orange. What does that little I don't know, syllogism or whatever, what does that say about knowledge itself? Like, because it does seem that we're capable of being in agreement, but we're not capable of knowing that we're actually agreeing.
Yeah, we're capable of doing what we're doing right now. We're capable of having a conversation, and conversation is what sort of drives understanding, the search for understanding. It's a relentless, imperfect, contingent, partly subjective operation, and it's not a private operation either. We do it. It's a social practice. We have a conversation like we're having right now. We're trying to understand something, whether it's the color orange or the meaning of what Canada is or whatever. We can talk about it and disagree with each other, have our own interpretations, but those disagreements can be fruitful. They can be the conversation can go somewhere. We can try to resolve our disagreement because we have language, we have conversation.
Is that so? Is that an emergent property, or how? Where does that come from? Do you think that because I guess animals have conversations too, just without the sophistication that we do with words. But what do you think? Is that what makes is that consciousness? Like, what is it about conversation? Do you think that, like, I completely agree. It seems to be the building block of understanding, and conversations based on experience, which is experience is interpreted through shared symbols. But how do you, like, where does that come from? Is it just innate to us biologically, or is this civilization?
I think if you had to begin with biology, we are the kind of organisms that are structured in such a way, and our brains are structured in such a way that we are capable of language. We're disposed maybe to language. We are what Martin Heidegger a century ago called beings in the world, being in a culture, beings in a language. And these languages and worlds are again socially shared. I'm not in the world alone. I'm out here in the world with a lot of other people, and we're all engaged, I think, in this kind of socially shared agonistic struggle where we're trying to understand what there is, and what things mean, who we are, what is good. And it's a struggle. We often disagree, but not always. And when we can get somewhere, we can reason with each other. I think we're just the kind of beings that search for understanding. That's just the way we are. We search for personal self-understanding and national, cultural self-understanding, whatever group we belong to. We're always, I think, engaged at a deep level in this search for understanding and self-understanding.
I love that, and I want to go onto this whole idea of identity that you're talking about, and understanding. And part of our identity can be that we're understanding, seeking beings, I guess. But what do you think it is about being a human that makes us so attached to these identities that we have, to our own egos? And in fact, say something, you love something, and then someone else shits on it, right? That you feel personally attacked because you've extended your own emotional well-being into the world in the sense of the identity. Where does that come from in your mind? Is it part of this seeking to understand, or is it just what people would say from an evolutionary perspective, I guess, that we desire to be socially cohesive because social exclusion usually resulted in death in the past?
Yeah, I don't think I would give the evolutionary answer. I think I would say something like this. If you think about who you are, I mean, we all want to understand who we are. I mean, you grow up wanting to know not just what is the world like, but who am I in the world? What is my place in the world? Where do I belong in the world? What is my purpose in the world? But when I think about who I am, I'm not just looking within. We speak of introspection and, examining your own interiors. Well, what is there in your interior but stuff that's out there in the world?
Right.
Your inwardness kind of is that stuff out there in the world. Think of the stuff that's in your home, the stuff that you own, the stuff that's on your walls, the posters or the art or just the stuff that you own that is yours, that means something to you. You own something that you bought, or you saved up for, or you inherited, or you found, or something that you own that means something to you. Maybe someone gave it to you, or whatever. That thing is, we're likely to say, well, that thing is mine, it's not me. But it kind of,
Oh, interesting.
sense in which it is me. I mean, I don't just own it. I almost want to say that I am, at least in part, all of these things, not just my personal property, but the things, including social spaces, places that it's the world that I find myself already inside of. I'm a part of, I'm participating in this world that's made up of things and things that are mine. They pertain in some important, hard to describe, but a subtle, important way. They pertain to who I am, such that if someone comes along and destroys my stuff, I feel personally violated.
Right. Yeah.
Experiences like this, where you steal my stuff, or it's not just that you're stealing my stuff. I can go and buy more stuff. No, I can't go buy more stuff because that means something to me.
It's part of your story. How do you connect that? So I want to just try to take that to the macro level. What are the things that Canada owns that are it? I guess one of the examples I always think of is like the natural habitat and beauty that we have, particularly Banff, but like all over this country. There's just we're abundance. The amount of abundance that we have in this country is kind of baffling sometimes. And I was wondering if you could speak to like kind of how that plays into the Canadian identity, because I think it really does, and how you would see that from a philosophic standpoint, how we're shaped by this abundance.
I think that's exactly right. Geography, place, landscape, the climate, the sheer vastness of this land, especially relative to the population. We're still a relatively small population. Was it 38 million or something we have right now?
I mean, we're all talking about eventually getting to 100 million, and then you've got like Indonesia, it's going to have like 500 million by the time we have 100.
Yeah. 38 million is a very small number in world terms relative to the landmass that we're looking at. So a lot of philosophical work has been done lately, is being done now on the notion of place. And
yes.
How really good philosophical work. I haven't done any of it myself, but where the question is, what is the significance of place? How would, it's not just aesthetically beautiful, it's just more than that. It factors into, again, who we are, our sense of identity, our sense of who we are, my own personal sense of who I am, where we're rooted to a place. We come from somewhere.
Do you find, because I guess Stephen Harper obviously wrote his Right Now book or whatever, Right Here, Right Now. No. Anyway, his book about the somewheres versus the nowheres. And do you find, I mean, you're a professor, you see students coming through, you're teaching them like the art of being human is essentially what I consider philosophy. Are you noticing a lack of place, a lack of rootedness right now?
I can't say that I've noticed it. I can't say that I've noticed it in my students anyway. So,
because I do get this sense, particularly from Canadians, that there is kind of a lack of rootedness, and yet there's a more, and we talk about this in the podcast a few times, but the rootedness of Canadianism is actually generally regional identity outside of Ontario.
Yeah.
More so than even being Canadian. And I think that comes from almost a radical love of place, right? And I think one of the founding nations, the Quebecois, obviously have taken that to heart, and they don't just love their people, they love their land, right? They love that this is their home.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting when you say that, because I think that is something that's actually lacking, is a true love of home as much as it could be.
Yeah, I think I've observed something like that. I don't know that I can say that I've seen it in my students. I think I see it in the culture, though, that I am. Maybe some of this is a function of how many people grow up. I mean, if you grow up in a suburb, most people grow up in large cities and in a suburb. I didn't grow up there. I grew up sort of in the country. I still live sort of in the country, with the same St. Lawrence River to my south, to the
Yep.
south,
Yep.
basically on the same highway, Highway 2, which is an old highway. But that sense of place, for me, is very important. My sense of direction is always informed by, where's the St. Lawrence River? Okay,
Right.
it's,
Right.
I can point to it right now. That's important. I don't know that would be the same if I grew up in a suburb of Toronto. Many of my students come from Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal, or you grow up in the suburbs and in a large city like that. I don't know whether there's the same sense of rootedness in place, if it's kind of a standardized place. If you come from more of a rural setting, or a smaller city, or something that's maybe a little bit more distinctive or close to the land, then my sense anyway, is that maybe your sense of place is a little more deeply rooted.
And what do you see as I mean, obviously, I think on an emotional level, everyone can understand the importance of having place, but what do you see, like, have you watched different people who have a sense of place, people who don't? What is their overall kind of philosophic demeanor, their existential reality?
I think if you don't have a strong sense of place, or belonging, you might, if you were to become more philosophically minded, you might, I'm guessing, be more tempted toward some kind of rationalism or some kind of philosophy, that blackboard philosophy, rather than the kind of philosophy I tend to prefer, which is more existential, hermeneutical, phenomenological, more personal. There is more personal philosophy, and then there's more rationalistic, sort of blackboard philosophy. I've never really seen the point of what I call blackboard philosophy. It never grabbed me when I was a teenager or now. It just sort of leaves me cold. Whereas the more personal, experiential, phenomenological, historical side of philosophy has always really grabbed me very hard. I just think that when you think about this more, for me, more interesting side of philosophy, you tend to understand more about life. I think it makes it possible for you to see a little more deeply into things. You might not be as skilled a logician as some.
Right. So, what do you think of the state of Canadian philosophy, and do you have any Canadian philosophers that you'd recommend to the listeners? And what has Canada contributed to philosophy?
This might surprise you, because there are a lot of really first-rate philosophers in Canada. Many of what I consider to be the better philosophers in the world are Canadians, or are working in Canada. And this has been true, since, I would say, about the 1970s. Just a few names: Charles Taylor, Will Kemlicka, Barry Allen. My own PhD supervisors, Gary Madison, he died a few years ago. He did great first-rate work. Graham Nicholson, Jeff Mitcherling, Jean Grondin, James Mensch, Lisa Gunther, Chloe Taylor. It's just a long list. Again, these are not household names, but they're really good philosophers.
What do you see as Canada's contribution right now to the field, and like, what are you excited about in Canada's philosophic work right now?
Well, there's quite a diversity there too. I work in philosophy in a more continental European tradition, and many of the philosophers I've mentioned are working in that same tradition and carrying the conversation forward in a lot of very different but productive ways. So I couldn't say that there's one area within philosophy where Canadians have sort of, cornered the market or making great inroads. I think Canadian philosophers are making inroads in a lot of the subdisciplines of philosophy.
Oh, I love that. And one of the things we try to do on this podcast is raise up Canadians and actually celebrate what our country is. And one of the things I say to a lot of people is, Scotland was never going to have the British Empire, but it did produce the Scottish Enlightenment, which gave us capitalism. And I'm really encouraged to hear you say that we have some first-rate thinkers here in Canada working on some of these sub problems of philosophy because I do see Canada as essentially taking on sort of hopefully a Scottish Enlightenment role in the world, where we wrestle through some of these ideas that are plaguing the world and actually get to some practical solutions. What do you think of that idea? And have you studied the Scottish Enlightenment much?
The Scottish Enlightenment,
Like the John Stuart Mills and the Glasgow,
yeah.
Edinburgh School and all that.
I haven't focused too much on John Stuart Mill. I read his work years ago, but I'm interested. I find the Scottish history quite interesting, but I don't work in that area.
Right. Yeah. I was just more interested in that. And you think small countries can have undue impacts if they focus themselves on intellectual pursuits, I guess is my point. And I was wondering if you see that. Do you see a role in the world for Canada to kind of do that? And what would be kind of one of the exports? I love what we were talking about earlier about this idea of it's kind of this impossible country that continues on seeking unity and diversity, which is, a bit of an oxymoron, but it seems to be working. Is that one of the ideas that once fully fleshed out, you think we could present to the world? Or, yeah, just kind of, I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I understand what you're getting at. I mean, one of the most obvious areas in which Canadian philosophers have made a pretty substantial contribution is within political philosophy, and on this, specifically on this question of the politics of recognition, the politics of identity. Charles Taylor, Will Kilmica, various others have been talking about this, writing about this for a few decades now. This is part of, it's very characteristically Canadian that we're always asking, what is Canada?
True.
Are we two solitudes? Are we three? What are we?
Yeah.
How many are we? and this whole question of unity and diversity. Can we recognize the other? What is the politics? How can a democracy of the kind that we want recognize cultural diversity? That series of questions has been pursued, internationally by political philosophers for a long time now, but it's been carried on by Canadian writers and a number of Canadian writers in a very distinctive, very important way. So I think it's fair to say that Canadian philosophy in a lot of areas is sort of punching above our weight. In this particular set of questions, I think we certainly are there as well. I mean, Canadians have been dealing with the question of how do we how can we have a civil some kind of rapprochement in a highly pluralistic nation, not just with two cultures, but 3, 4, whatever the number is, it's a large number. How can you have unity of any kind, some kind of rational rapprochement and just society amidst the diversity, amidst the plurality? Much of the world is dealing with this line of questioning, but Canada, we've been living with this. This is not an academic question for Canadians. We've been living with this throughout our history, really from day one. The question has been, well, how can we build the kind of society we want in the face of, the set of cultures and peoples that we have here, and what kind of democratic rapprochement is possible, what kind of institutions, what kind of public policies make that possible. Does a classical liberal philosophy of individual rights, is that going to solve the kind of problems that you have in a society like this, or do we need to make the move to group rights, as Will Cunliffe and others have argued? I'm a little bit skeptical of that myself. I think individual rights is what we need to.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Well, for the layman, can you summarize kind of where you think Charles Taylor got us in terms of the identity question? And because I'm very interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Charles Taylor. I read Charles Taylor's books years ago, like about 20 years ago, and then I stopped at some point. So most of it I've probably forgotten by now. But he's one of the most important philosophers of his generation in the world. Very, very well known globally. His contribution to political philosophy, drawing on some old memories.
Yeah, no worries, no pressure. But I know that I went to Trinity Western University, I guess 10 years ago, and he was part of our curriculum. And I think your average Canadian doesn't even know we have a world famous philosopher.
Yeah, well, we have. Yeah, he might be the biggest name. Yes, of his generation, I would say definitely the biggest name. But he's well known for he's a great Hegel scholar. I think it was his first book was a very good book on GWF Hegel, German philosopher. Then he becomes a communitarian political philosopher. Politics of recognition is something that he writes a great deal about. Politics of modernity, the Malaise is a little book, as I recall.
Yes, that was the one that they had us read, the Malaise of Modernity.
The Malaise of Modernity, I think I read it 25 years ago.
Yeah.
But I still remember parts of it. Then at some point I lost track of his writing. There's too much to read in this business.
Yeah, you're never going to run out of books, right?
Yeah.
So what's a philosophic idea that just, because we only got about 5 more minutes here, but what's a philosophic idea that just sets your heart on fire and gets you that you are really interested in right now at this moment? Like what is your mind kind of mulling over?
These days, I'm mostly focusing on philosophy of history. Getting back to where we started this conversation, I've just become fascinated with history and the philosophy of history, which is an old discipline, but it's kind of neglected these days. It's a minor subdiscipline in philosophy, the philosophy of history. The old Enlightenment notion of historical progress is kind of regarded as passé by most philosophers, but it creates quite a vacuum of what is to fill in what comes after progress. How are we to understand? Is it possible to get any kind of big picture understanding of human history or national history
without an idea of progress?
Without progress or some kind of teleological notion. Is there a theory of historical understanding on one hand, but on the other hand, is it possible to understand the big picture of historical change without saying, well, it's all part of one big master plan, and here's the beginning, and here's the middle, and here's the end, and it's a story of progress? Whether it's a political story or a theological story or a scientific evolutionary one, or whatever it is, I'm skeptical of the notion of progress. I'm somewhat skeptical of historical evolution, cultural evolution, but I'm especially interested these days in the philosophy of history.
I love that, and not only just you're not just interested in what happened. It's why did it happen, and why do things happen at all?
Yeah, why did things happen? Why did that happen? And where are we? I mean, all of this, I think, is in the service. Any philosophical understanding of history is all in the service of, again, self-understanding, historical self-understanding. Where are we? What's happening to us? How did we get here? Where might we be going? Well, we can't really predict things with any certainty, but we can know the story as it has unfolded to this point.
Yeah. It requires observation, right? It requires awareness. You have to be awake in order to even ask these questions. And I think that I love that you approached this episode this way, because it's such an important conversation to be having. We're saying, well, what is the Canadian story? We're trying to tell it, but we should also be asking, like, why are stories so important to us, right? Why is this idea of place so significant? What is the good life, right? And how do we go about living it?
Yeah, these questions are all intertwined. You to answer one, you have to answer them all.
Right.
I think as you can pull one thread out and try and analyze it on its own, but I don't think you make much progress that way. I think you make some headway in understanding big, complex questions like this by sort of seeing them in their organic interconnectedness.
Yeah.
History is like that. I'm just trying to understand Canadian history. You have to see it relative to American and British and French and so on history. And
nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah. You don't understand anything in a vacuum. You have to see it in relation to everything that's around it.
And maybe that's a good way to talk about, like, identity also. It isn't a vacuum. It is created through your environment and place. And I loved what you said. I just wanted to bring it back to this, is the idea of the things that we own, the things that we cherish. Those aren't just belongings. They are being, which is us.
Yeah, they are. I mean, there's some truth in saying that they are us, or we are those things.
Yeah, and that's really the foundation of what it means to have a Canadian story. Is we're not just people who live in Canada. Canada isn't just the country that belongs to us. We are Canada.
Yeah, in a deep way, you're uprooted, and you're not yourself. You have to change some deep things about yourself.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated having you on, and thank you for taking this time. I'm sure we'll have you on again to talk more about this, but I was just a very rich reflection on, I think, the most important question anyone can ask. Who am I?
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.